So the 10th and final National Women's Liberation Conference took place in Birmingham in April 1978. Writing in The Guardian, Anna Coote described how the bookstalls offered the widest range of feminist literature to be found anywhere in the UK. Trestle tables groaned under piles of Ronioed papers from theorists of all persuasions. Coote powerfully evokes the textures and cultures of women's liberation activism, a political environment saturated with printed papers, pamphlets, bulletins, and newsletters through which information and fiery new ideas could be expressed and communicated. These committed publishing networks had and would continue to sustain that movement as it developed new directions in the coming decades. Writing in 2017, Agatha Bynes suggested that feminist periodicals mattered not only because they provided information, but also because they gave women a feeling of connection to others in a larger struggle. Indeed, scholars have persuasively theorized the galvanizing effects of magazine production and readership in the construction of collective political identities. It was at that WLM conference that a feminist artist workshop agreed to start publishing a visual arts newsletter, and this is the announcement made shortly afterwards in Wires, which was the WLM newsletter. There were, of course, other feminist periodicals in existence. However, this newsletter was, I think, the first UK serial publication dedicated solely to women's art. And in 1983, it would be joined by the Women Artists Slide Library Journal. That's it. The lo-fi newsletter consisted of densely typed, duplicated and stapled pages, and around 4 issues were published before pausing in June 1979 and relaunching in 1980 as the magazine Feminist Arts News. And I haven't mentioned her, but actually Monica Ross was one of the founding members of the newsletter and a fan. So Fan published 45 issues before closing suddenly in 1993 following withdrawal of Arts Council funding. And as an early editorial put it, our aim was to provide a communications network, offering support, information, skill sharing, documentation of work, and also a forum for debate relevant to our practice as artists and women. In Anti-Book, Nicholas Thoburn writes, as the product of particular logics and conditions, a media object is also their bearer, at once consolidating and extending the social relations associated with its production, circulation, and consumption. So what then were these logics and conditions that circulated around Fan? I think we could situate it in relation to women's liberation politics, to post-colonial theory and anti-colonial activism, economics of the 1980s art world, new reprographic technologies, a growth in higher education. In short, far too many conditions to discuss here today. But prompted by this conference's call for papers, in this presentation, I want to offer some reflections on print networks, region and diaspora, and in the limited time available, raise possibilities for thinking about the place of magazines in the making of the UK women's art movement and the negotiation of its limits. Feminist Arts News defined itself as a magazine by and for women artists. Distinctively, each issue was proposed and compiled by a guest editorial group from around the UK, with production coordinated by a core business collective. The dispersed production structure demanded extraordinary amounts of labour and travel, yet the editors refused to abandon it, even under pressure from funding bodies. And they explained why in a 1980 application to the Arts Council. We have various aims in using this method of procedure. We do not want the magazine to become attached to any one power base in terms of editorial control. Movable group editorship counteracts that tendency. Neither do we want the magazine to be generated from just one place, because those elsewhere often see this as an alienating situation. Women in the community are particularly prone to the resultant sense of isolation. We have chosen a thematic approach to the magazine, partly because it fits easily with the above requirements, and partly because we believe that issues can be more thoroughly aired and in a more lively manner by this method. So this decentralised mode of production resulted in a kaleidoscopic, sometimes uneven publication that was constantly evolving, shifting, and reimagining itself, thereby remaining alert to heterodox viewpoints and able to accommodate multiple positions. Fan refused to define art or feminism for its readers. It instead provided a site at which they could collectively examine, discuss, and struggle towards that knowledge. Stephen Shikaitis and Joanna Fiegel have defined comradely publishing practice as one that is not necessarily intent on trying to convince anyone of anything, but is rather working towards establishing conditions for the co-production of meaning. In such instances, they explain, and I quote, "Publishing is not something that occurs at the end of a process of thought, a bringing forth of artistic and intellectual labour, but rather establishes a social process where this may further develop and unfold." Fan arguably created or attempted to create such conditions by destabilising editorial orthodoxy and establishing a flexible, horizontally structured network that reproduced the small group politics of women's liberation organising. As issue number 1 announced, the production collectives are voluntary and suggest their own themes. What do you want to read about in art? You don't need a group, just sit at home and wait for the articles. 3 friends can paste, we print. It's part of feminist politics. So flicking through the pages of feminist arts news, readers would see notices and reviews from, for instance, Glasgow, Wolverhampton, Sheffield, Bristol and Leeds, while themed issues were compiled by women's groups in London, Devon, Liverpool, Birmingham, and of course here in the North East. Emphasising the value of print media networks, researchers have described feminist papers as, I quote, lifelines to isolated groups in small towns. While one subscriber to Spare Rib recalls it coming as a communication from another world. The media theorist Kate Eshorn has written about the deterritorialisation engendered by late 20th century reprographic technologies, describing how grassroots print media made mobile the aesthetics and politics of particular cultural scenes. She encourages us to ask what types of publics become imaginable through the print technologies of that period that would have otherwise remained unimaginable. So for us, for me, it's thinking about what public or counter-public did Fan's participatory reader network bring into being. In a pre-internet communication landscape, Fan's pages created a kind of notice board effect by reprinting conference papers and reports, highlighting or publishing critical essays, announcements for events and exhibitions, letters and personal ads, and reproducing artworks. A range of visual and textual features that reflect the extent of its political and social networking. However, Fan's editorial collectives represented a both geographically and ideologically diverse public. So while its periodical network did connect regions, places, and people, this web was also characterised by differences that had to be negotiated. To begin, Fan's politicised investigations tended to be organised by medium, with early issues addressing performance, comics, craft, education, film and video, photography, textiles, and there were themed issues on peace and women's space. From autumn 1988, however, we can trace a decisive shift as the magazine began to place identity at the heart of its debates about feminist art and aesthetics. For Fan 2.8, Lubaina Hamid and Maud Sulter edited the important issue Black Women's Creativity of the African Diaspora, in which Sulter asked, Who makes black women's work visible, if not other black women? The magazine reproduced works by Jeannie Montesumi Ash, Ingrid Pollard, Claudette Johnson, Sulter Hamid, and Rita Keegan. A co-authored editorial letter frames this mediation of black feminist art practice. And as Catherine Grant highlighted in a recent article, and I quote, "At the top of the letter, a photograph of them underlines their collaboration on the project and their identities as black women. This convention is found in other magazines, but in copies of Fan it stands out as one of only 2 times this was done." The following magazine issue, 2.9, focused on along the lines of resistance, around an exhibition which has been mentioned a few times today, organised by Claire Satterley, Shishba Biswas and Sarah Edge at Rochdale and Cooper Galleries. Indeed, as Alice noted, around this time, it's notable that Feminist Arts News maintained fairly consistent links to Rochdale, with the arts officer Sarah Edge joining the editorial collective in 1987, Maud Sulter joined the collective in 1989, Hamid co-edited individual issues, and all contributed essays and artworks, and Jill Morgan also contributed writing at this time. I didn't know until Alexandra's paper that Monica Ross, one of the founders, was also born then in Rochdale, so there are obviously earlier links that I'll have to look into. So the magazine carried announcements for events and discussions of work that was taking place at the gallery. And this, I think, is a useful reminder in today's explorations that print periodicals played a vital role in connecting and maintaining this wide network of cultural practices. So in 1989, in that issue actually, the production editors of Fan acknowledged that our history as a predominantly white, able-bodied group has influenced our decisions on the editorial direction of the magazine. We want to use this space and the subsequent launches to invite critical comments. And this was followed immediately in the next issue with the first explicit Fan policy statements. I don't yet know the ins and outs of how this policy was reached, but a version of it was printed at the start of every subsequent issue. The editors wanted, and I quote, "to work towards the magazine being representative of the different cultural, social, political, and economic groups of women that exist, and to encourage work that challenges oppressive theories and practices in terms of race, class, sexuality, and disability." Throughout its remaining 4 years of publication, Fan foregrounded efforts to address the blind spots of the women's movement, with themed issues published on Black women's art in Europe, disability arts, working class women, Irish women, and lesbian women's art, as well as issues on cultural imperialism, photography, and modernism. So issue 3.4, which you can see on the far right on women, modernism, and modernity, is indicative of the pioneering intellectual directions that opened up and destabilized established canons. Framed by Lubaina Hamid's portrait of Gertrude Stein on the front cover, the editorial describes the issue as, and I quote, "a dissection of the wholesale theft of African cultures and images, of the silences on women's work, and a long overdue address to Black women's creativity in and deconstruction of modernism." Editorials and articles repeatedly returned to questions of difference in terms of race and sexuality, class difference. Chilo Kamari Berman published a lot on class difference, emphasizing that the middle-class character of Fan could in many ways be alienating. They talked about difference between feminist generations, and of course regional difference was also mentioned. The organisers of Along the Line suggested that there was incredible resistance to their work in London. And I quote from an interview about how it's acceptable up north, it's comfortable, it's all right. They don't mind it being up here because it's a distance, and it's all really down south where the money is. So I wanted to return to the newsletter's announcement from 1978 in which the editors invited future readers to consider how you even came to call yourself an artist. 13 years later, in spring 1991, Fan considered Where Are We Now? And Dion Sparks asked a series of questions to readers that echoed that earlier inquiry. I wanted, she wrote, women to articulate the basis and assumptions of naming themselves an artist. However, she expanded on this. Again, I quote. But behind those questions put to our contributors was also a way to gauge our difference, to show that below the surface our concerns are diverse, varied, conflicting even, and who will minute the agenda when, for instance, racism demands action among us. And this, I think, highlights the complexities and new directions that had emerged in critical feminist thought throughout that decade. And perhaps feminist art periodicals had an important role to play in that. According to Beck Wonders, periodicals enabled dissent, disagreement, and even conflict. The very form is open to polyphony and change. While Melanie Waters has written extensively about the emotions and bad feelings that could surface in women's movement magazines, as they consistently provided spaces in which the feelings associated with women's liberation could be articulated and explored. So, in conclusion, I hope this paper has imparted some sense of the strong cultural network sustained and recorded on the pages of Feminist Arts News. And I want fundamentally to suggest that magazines did not simply communicate changes that were taking place in artist studios, galleries, or exhibitions. They were constitutive of those changes. Periodicals provided print sites in which the limits and politics of the women's art movement could be tested, contested, and transformed. Thank you.